Remember when three of the most talked about actors in America were cast in the same war epic, and two of them despised each other so much that one threatened to walk off the production entirely if the other struck a particular pose, while the third had survived a car crash so devastating that audiences reportedly bought tickets mainly to study how much his face had changed? One of those actors called this the finest performance of his entire life. Another spent the production being told he was wasting two-thirds of his talent. The third was a former comedian everyone assumed couldn't act at all, and he was the only one whose career the film actually helped. Directed by Edward Dmytryk, written by Edward Anhalt from Irwin Shaw's 1948 novel, and starring Marlon Brando, Montgomery Clift, and Dean Martin, with Hope Lang, Barbara Rush, May Britt, and Maximilian Schell rounding out the cast, The Young Lions told three interlocking stories across the Second World War. A disillusioned German officer, a Jewish American draftee fighting bigotry inside his own army, and a Broadway entertainer trying to dodge danger. It ran nearly 3 hours. It made back its budget, and then some. And behind the scenes, it was a quiet war of its own, fought between two of the greatest screen actors who ever lived, who never once appeared on screen together. Today, we're counting down 15 weird facts about The Young Lions, and stick around for number one because the man who directed this film had a secret in his past that connected him directly to one of the darkest chapters in Hollywood history, and it changes how you read the entire production. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. Brando or Clift, who gives a better performance here? Make the case below. Alright, 3 soldiers, 1 war. Let's get into it. Montgomery Clift was, by 1957, one of the most respected actors of his generation, a man who had brought a new kind of interior, psychologically detailed performance to American film before Brando became the name most associated with it. He had been nominated for Academy Awards. He had defined a certain kind of wounded American masculinity in films like From Here to Eternity. He was not a man given to overstatement about his own work, and he said, about his role as Noah Ackerman in The Young Lions, the Jewish soldier who endures relentless anti-Semitism inside the American army and refuses to be broken by it, that it was the best performance of his life, that he couldn't have given more of himself, that he would never be able to do it again. This is an extraordinary statement from an actor whose filmography includes some of the most celebrated performances of the 1950s. Clift wasn't comparing Noah Ackerman favorably to his lesser work. He was placing it above all of it, above the work that had made him famous, above the performances that had earned him his reputation. Whatever Clift found in that character, whatever he poured into a role about a man maintaining his dignity under sustained cruelty, he believed it was the peak of everything he had ever done as an actor. He was almost certainly right that he'd never do it again. He had less than a decade left to live. The reason Clift's performance in The Young Lions carries the specific quality it does, the worn, haunted, visibly suffering presence that critics noticed immediately, is that he made the film roughly 2 years after a car accident that had destroyed his face. In May 1956, after leaving a dinner party at Elizabeth Taylor's home, Clift blacked out behind the wheel, drove off a dark winding road, and wrapped his car around a telephone pole. He was found crumpled under the dashboard, bloody and close to death. His jaw was broken, his sinus was fractured, his nose was snapped. His face required extensive reconstructive surgery. He was never the same. The surgery restored function, but not the specific beauty that had defined his earlier screen presence, and the chronic pain that followed drove a dependence on alcohol and painkillers that an acting teacher would later call the longest suicide in Hollywood history. The Young Lions was one of his first major films afterward, and audiences reportedly went partly to study the difference, to see, scene by scene, how much of the old Clift remained. The pain in his performance was not entirely an acting choice. Some of it was simply visible, because it was real, and there was no longer any way for him to hide it. The rivalry between Montgomery Clift and Marlon Brando, two actors constantly compared, constantly positioned against each other as the defining talents of their generation, reached a specific and almost absurd flashpoint over the film's ending. Clift was deeply concerned about how Brando intended to play Christian Diestel's death scene. He had a particular fear that Brando would die with his arms outstretched in a deliberate echo of the crucifixion, turning a Nazi officer's death into a Christ-like martyrdom. Clift considered this not just artistically wrong, but morally objectionable, and he made his position unambiguous. If Brando died at the end of the picture with his arms outstretched in a Christ-like motif, Clift would walk off the set. The threat captures the entire dynamic between the two men in a single image. Clift believed that Brando's instinct toward sympathy, toward making every character he played beautiful and tragic and worthy of the audience's love, was being applied to a character who did not deserve it. The disagreement wasn't really about a pose, it was about whether a Nazi should be allowed to die as a saint. Clift thought the answer was obviously no. Brando, by every account of his approach to the role, thought the answer was considerably more complicated, and that complication is the thing that would define the entire production. The tension between the two actors wasn't confined to the ending. Throughout the production, Clift was openly contemptuous of what he saw as Brando's lack of discipline and effort. He called Brando a slob. He stated to others on the production that Brando was using only about a third of his actual talent, that the most naturally gifted actor of his generation was coasting, indulging himself, refusing to do the rigorous interior work that Clift considered the actual job. Coming from Clift, who poured everything he had into Noah Ackerman and called it the performance of his life, the criticism had a specific edge. It wasn't jealousy, it was disappointment. The irony underneath the insult is that Brando, by all accounts, was working incredibly hard on the young lions, just not in a way Clift recognized as work. Brando was obsessively reconceiving the entire character of Christian Diestel, lobbying the director and writer to fundamentally change who the character was. He wasn't being lazy, he was being something Clift found arguably worse, a star using his power to reshape the material around his own desire to be liked. The two greatest screen actors of their generation were on the same production, and they could not even agree on what acting was. They never shared a single scene. Here is one of the strangest structural facts about The Young Lions. It brought together Marlon Brando and Montgomery Clift, arguably the two most important and influential American screen actors of the 1950s, the two men who had transformed what film acting could be, and never once put them in the same shot. The film's three-strand structure keeps Brando's German officer entirely separate from Clift's American soldier until the very end. And even then, the way the climax is staged means the two men do not share the screen in the way audiences might have anticipated from the billing. For viewers who came to The Young Lions specifically to watch these two titans act opposite each other, the film offers nothing of the kind. They exist in parallel, in separate stories, in separate countries, in separate moral universes, converging only at the moment of Diestel's death. It is the only film the two of them ever made together, and it functions almost as a deliberate refusal of the thing it seems to promise. Two of the greatest actors who ever lived, in one film, who might as well have been making two different movies, which, in a sense, given Brando's campaign to rewrite his half, they were. In Irwin Shaw's original novel, Christian Diestel is not a misunderstood idealist. He is a committed, hardening, increasingly brutal Nazi, a man who grows more callous and more dehumanized as the war progresses until survival is all that's left of him. Brando refused to play that character. He campaigned intensively to transform Diestel into something the novel never intended, a fundamentally decent man, an idealist seduced by Nazism's early promises who gradually awakens to its evil and comes to loathe both the ideology and himself. According to a 1958 feature in Life magazine, Brando delivered a 15-hour analysis of the character to the director, the producer, and the screenwriter, arguing his case in exhaustive detail. The director, Edward Dmytryk, later disputed the 15-hour figure, saying he never spent anything like that long with Brando, and that he and the screenwriter had already arrived at a more sympathetic conception of the character independently. But the direction of travel is not disputed by anyone. The film's Diestel is dramatically softer, more conflicted, and more sympathetic than the novels. Brando wanted to play a good man trapped in a monstrous cause. He largely got his way, and the author of the novel was, by every available account, furious about it. Irwin Shaw, who had written The Young Lions in 1948 as a serious examination of how ordinary men become instruments of atrocity, watched his hardcore Nazi character be reshaped into a sympathetic idealist and did not hide his anger. His assessment of why Brando had insisted on the changes was blunt and personal. Brando played Diestel in a sympathetic way, Shaw said, because Brando wanted to be sympathetic on screen. Not because the character demanded it, not because the story was better served by it, because Brando, the most magnetic actor of his era, could not stand to play someone the audience would simply hate. Shaw's complaint cuts to something real about Brando's entire approach to acting, and Clift had been making the same point from the other direction. The disagreement over Diestel wasn't a technical dispute about characterization, it was a fundamental argument about what a film about Nazism owed to the truth. Shaw had written a book partly about the banality and brutality of how decent-seeming people commit evil. The film transformed its central German into a man too good for the cause he served, which is, arguably, exactly the comforting lie Shaw had written the book to dismantle. The author and the star wanted opposite things. The star had more power. If you're starting to see that this film was basically a three-way argument about whether a Nazi deserves the audience's sympathy, hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment. Was Brando right to make Diestel sympathetic, or was the author right to be furious about it? Make your case below. Now, back to the war. The artistic argument over whether Christian Diestel should be sympathetic has a much less romantic explanation sitting underneath it, and it survives in a studio document. In a May 1957 memo to the producer, director, and screenwriter, executive producer Buddy Adler laid out a strikingly commercial rationale for softening the film's portrayal of Germans. The film needed, Adler argued, one strong German character who could speak for the German people as a whole and shift the moral guilt onto the Nazi leadership rather than the entire German population. His reasoning was explicitly financial. A successful film could earn $1 million in the German market, and unless the production took care to portray ordinary Germans sympathetically, the film would not be received well in Germany at all. This reframes the entire Brando versus Shaw conflict. The sympathetic Diestel wasn't purely the product of Brando's vanity or his artistic philosophy, as Shaw believed. It was also, and perhaps primarily, a business decision made at the executive level to protect the film's earnings in post-war Germany. Brando's instinct to be liked on screen and the studio's instinct to be liked at the German box office pointed in exactly the same direction. The result was a Nazi the audience could love, arrived at through a collision of an actor's ego and an accountant's projection. 12 years after the war the film was depicting had ended, Irwin Shaw's novel placed the subject of anti-Semitism at its absolute center. It was not a backdrop or a subplot, it was a core concern of the book, woven through both the German and American storylines, an unflinching examination of bigotry on both sides of the war. The film significantly diminished this. While Clift's storyline as Noah Ackerman retains the powerful sequences of anti-Semitic abuse within the American army, some of the film's most affecting material, the broader treatment of anti-Semitism that defined the novel, was substantially reduced in the adaptation. This reduction connects directly to the softening of Diestel and the commercial logic behind it. A film designed to play sympathetically in 1950s Germany, built around a Nazi the audience could forgive, had structural reasons to handle the subject of anti-Semitism carefully, to contain it, to localize it, to keep it from implicating the sympathetic German at the film's center. The novel had used anti-Semitism as a lens for understanding the entire moral catastrophe of the war. The film used it as one soldier's personal trial, powerful but bounded. Both Clift and Shaw complained that the film bore little resemblance to the book. This is a significant part of what they meant. Dean Martin, the singer, the comedian, the recently UN-partnered half of Martin and Lewis, was not the first choice to play Michael Whiteacre. The role had been intended for Tony Randall, who became unavailable. Martin stepped into the part almost as a substitution, at a moment in his career when nobody in Hollywood was certain he could carry dramatic material at all. His comedy partnership with Jerry Lewis had dissolved 2 years earlier, in 1956, and the conventional industry wisdom held that Lewis had been the talent and Martin the disposable straight man. The Young Lions was Martin's chance to prove otherwise, and he had landed it essentially by default. The outcome is one of the genuine surprises in the film's history. Of the three leads, Brando seeking to revive a sagging box office, Clift seeking a comeback and an Oscar, Dean Martin was the only one whose career the film meaningfully advanced. He proved he could act. He made the transition from comedian to dramatic performer that the industry had assumed was impossible. The man who got the part because someone else dropped out, whom everyone expected to embarrass himself alongside two of the greatest actors alive, was the one who walked away from the Young Lions with his ambitions intact. The two legends got tension and disappointment. The substitute got a career. The friendship that formed between Montgomery Clift and Dean Martin during The Young Lions is one of the more genuinely moving footnotes in the film's history. Clift, one of the most respected actors of his generation, took the inexperienced Martin under his wing during what was Martin's first major dramatic role. He helped him with the work, guided him through the demands of serious screen acting, and gave him the kind of support that made Martin's surprising success in the film possible. Martin never forgot it. What makes the friendship significant is what came after. As Clift's life spiraled in the years that followed, as his addictions deepened, as his behavior grew erratic, as much of Hollywood quietly distanced itself from a man who had become difficult and unreliable and painful to be around, Dean Martin stayed. When the rest of the industry had effectively disowned Clift, Martin continued to accompany him to parties, to stand by him, to be his friend in public at a time when that friendship carried a social cost. The comedian everyone underestimated turned out to have more loyalty than the entire establishment that had celebrated Clift and then abandoned him. Martin remembered who had helped him. He paid it back for the rest of Clift's life. Marlon Brando, dark-haired, famously the embodiment of a certain brooding American physicality, transformed himself physically to play Christian Diestel, bleaching his hair blonde to fit the Aryan ideal the character was meant to represent. The image of a blonde Brando, broad-shouldered and Germanic, struck many viewers as so far from his established screen persona that it tipped into the uncanny. Some critics found the performance a masterpiece. Others found it self-indulgent, overly brooding, mannered to the point of unintentional comedy. There is a genuine historical irony buried in the casting that few people knew at the time. Brando did, in fact, have German ancestry, a patrilineal ancestor named Johann Wilhelm Brandau, a German immigrant who had come to New York in the early 1700s. The actor playing the idealized German officer, bleaching himself into a vision of the master race, was several generations removed from an actual German immigrant whose name had been Americanized into Brando. Whether Brando knew or cared about this connection isn't clear, but the man who reshaped a Nazi into a sympathetic figure, who wanted above all to be understood and forgiven on screen, was reaching back toward a German heritage that was genuinely, if distantly, his own. The film's climax departs from Irwin Shaw's novel in a way that fundamentally changes its meaning. In the book, the final confrontation has Diestel kill Noah Ackerman before being killed himself. The Nazi takes a Jewish soldier's life as a last act before his own death. The film reverses and reshapes this entirely. Diestel, by the film's end, is a broken man who has rejected everything he once believed, and his death is staged as a kind of release rather than a final act of violence. The screenplay's two major departures from the novel, the softening of Diestel throughout and the rewriting of the ending, work together to transform the story's entire moral architecture. This is the change that enraged both Clift and Shaw, and it's the change Clift had tried to police with his threat to walk off the set over the crucifixion pose. The novel ended with a Nazi committing one final murder. The film ended with a Nazi achieving something like redemption through death. These are not the same story. Shaw said Clift was as bitter as he was about what he called the deformation of the book. Two of the people most central to the film, its source author and one of its 3 stars, agreed that the adaptation had betrayed the original. They were overruled by a star who wanted to be loved and a studio that wanted German box office. When Montgomery Clift declared Noah Ackerman the best performance of his life, the one he could never top, the one into which he had poured everything he had, there was a terrible accuracy to the claim that he may not have fully intended. The Young Lions was released in 1958. Clift would be dead by 1966 at the age of 45. The decade between the accident and his death, the years that contained The Young Lions and a dwindling handful of other performances, was the long decline that his acting teacher had called the longest suicide in Hollywood history. He continued to work. He earned another Oscar nomination for Judgment at Nuremberg in 1961, playing, with painful resonance, a victim of the Nazis. But the roles grew harder to secure as his reputation for unreliability spread and his physical condition deteriorated. When he died in his New York brownstone in July 1966, found by his live-in companion who had to climb a ladder to reach his locked bedroom, he had been preparing for another film. The man who called The Young Lions the peak of his life was, even as he made it, already inside the slow ending that the car accident had begun. He knew the performance was the best he'd ever give. He may not have known how literally true that would turn out to be. Edward Dmytryk, who directed The Young Lions, carried a history into the production that reframes the entire thing. Less than a decade earlier, Dmytryk had been one of the Hollywood 10, the group of filmmakers who refused to cooperate with the Haus Un, American Activities Committee's investigation into communist influence in Hollywood, and who were imprisoned and blacklisted for it. Dmytryk had served time, and then, unlike the others, he had changed course. He testified, cooperated with the committee, and named names, identifying colleagues as communists in order to resume his own career. He was the only member of the Hollywood 10 to do so. This makes The Young Lions a film about the moral compromises of decent people, the way ordinary individuals rationalize their participation in systems they know to be wrong. Directed by a man who had personally lived a version of exactly that dilemma. Dmytryk had faced a choice between his principles and his career, chosen his career, and named his former friends to save himself. Then he directed a film whose central character is a man who serves a cause he comes to despise. who keeps following orders, who tells himself he is decent while participating in atrocity. Whether Dmitrich saw himself in Christian Diestel is something he never directly addressed. But the man directing the story of a soldier who compromised everything to survive had, in the most literal Hollywood terms, done precisely that himself. The most sympathetic Nazi in 1950s cinema was shaped by a director who knew, from the inside, exactly what it cost to betray your principles and keep working. So there you have it. 15 weird facts about a war epic where two of the greatest actors alive feuded without sharing a scene, where the lead bleached his hair to play a heritage that was secretly his own, where a comedian nobody believed in turned out to be the only winner, where the source author and one of his stars agreed. The film had betrayed the book, and where the director had himself lived the exact moral collapse the film was depicting. Montgomery Clift called it the best work he ever did. He was gone within 8 years. Dean Martin stayed loyal to him until the end. And the most sympathetic Nazi Hollywood ever produced was a product of an actor who needed to be loved, a studio that needed German money, and a director who had already learned what it costs to save yourself. Like, subscribe, and share this with whoever first told you Dean Martin couldn't act. They were wrong, and this is the film that proves it. Until next time, every soldier in this story thought he was the decent one.